Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting, perhaps, can we say spooky, creepy episode of Words, Images, and Worlds. I'm gathering that creepiness from the background of my guest. This is Dr. Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock, professor of English at Central Michigan University. Dr. Weinstock, thank you for joining.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. People can find you on a radio show. Is this true? DJ Cypher's Dark Nation Radio?
Yes, that actually is true. I've been a DJ for more than 25 years at this point. Um, Much of it has now focused to two internet radio broadcasts. I do one on Sunday evenings called Dark Nation Radio, and then I do one twice a month called the Psychobilly Family Power Hour. And all of them are recorded and available on streaming platforms, including Mixcloud, where I go by Cypher Active is one word. It's Cypher. Cypher Active. If you look for that, you'll find over 400 recorded shows.
You are both a professor of English and a DJ. This is Cool Points Extreme. This is Cool Points Extreme. I hope this is linked on your syllabus too. I hope that you have that clearly available for your students.
No, I tend to keep those two sides of my personality separate, although sometimes the students discover it.
Yeah, yeah, that is very cool, very cool. You're also a person who engages in the scholarship of horror and other elements of literature. You now have the Horror Theory Reader, which you've authored, edited, and the Rutledge Introduction to the American Ghost Story, two titles of yours that are out in the world. Um, Curious by means of a first question. I've gotten into horror more in the past couple of years than ever before. I'm not exactly sure why. I've always been a science fiction fan, but what has your background as a scholar, as a reader, been like? How have you come to this place?
Well, my scholarship is an outgrowth of my own personal interests. I was early attracted to supernatural horror. Ghost stories, in particular, always fascinated me. And that became a focal point of my scholarship starting as a graduate student. It channeled into my doctoral dissertation at George Washington University, which had to do with dead letters, the idea of letters from the living that go astray and letters from the dead that arrive. So I was investigating the kind of the we call the ghostly elements of language, I guess you could say. Um, and then out of that emerged what became my first monograph, which is called Scare Tactics: Supernatural Fiction by American Women. And what I had discovered is there's a large body of uncollected supernatural fiction by American women from the 19th and the early parts of the 20th century. And a lot of it can be read as thinly veiled metaphors for the roles of women during the 19th and 20th century, where the ghost in the room was a metaphor for the woman who wasn't appreciated, acknowledged, listened to. So supernatural fiction was an outlet to express, I would say, political discontent, but in a disguised way that made it more palatable to readers. So I'm making the case in that book that there is this unacknowledged tradition of feminist supernatural writing in American literature. And it just kind of developed from there. I had an early edited collection called Spectral America, Phantoms and the National Imagination, which collected together uh, nonfiction essays from other scholars that explored the interweaving of the supernatural with American social life, beginning with the Puritans and leading up to the present, and the way that Salem, Massachusetts, markets itself as witch city, as a supernatural destination for seekers of the occult. I branched out subsequently. I have a book on vampires in cinema called Undead Cinema. Um,
Mhm.
or it's called The Vampire Cinema. This went out of my head.
I'll get it for you. I have the same issue with my edited books, which is that I usually come up with a title and then the publisher says, no, no, no. We have to use search terms that are findable. So
Yeah,
it always takes me a little while to like
yeah,
actually remember.
it'll come back to me in
Um,
just a second.
the vampire film Undead Cinema.
That's right, and I was calling it Undead Cinema. Yeah. Um, Silence that. I was the editor of the Ashgate Encyclopedia of Literary and Cinematic Monsters, which is a hefty tome. It'd be pretty good if you actually had to fend off a monster. Um, I became the editor of the Monster Theory Reader for the University of Minnesota Press, and most recently the Horror Theory Reader, which just came out in January of 2026.
Yes, yes. So very, very timely. We're having this conversation in January of 2026. As I mentioned, I'm sort of introspecting on how horror has become a part of my life. Um, how did you know this was going to be a research focus? What were the initial questions that started kind of prodding you in this direction?
Well, for the horror theory reader, it takes up the question of the appeal of horror, which seems counterintuitive on the surface. Why would anyone be attracted to things that are supposed to scare or disgust us? And what it
Mm-hmm.
does then is it assembles previously published investigations of that question. It goes all the way back to Aristotle and Greek drama, starting with the idea of catharsis from tragedy, because one of the models to try to explain how people can come to enjoy horror is that negative emotions are somehow purged or transformed into something that then becomes positive. Um, and then it moves forward from there. It picks up in the 18th century, actually, with authors who are writing about the appeal of Gothic novels and why anyone would want to read those. And then it moves into the present. I have a little section from Stephen King's Dance Macabre, where he talks about the fact that horror narratives often end up as being very conservative retrenchments in some respect, that you have the messy middle in which monsters run amok, but at the end, the evil is usually vanquished and the status quo tends to be restored. Um, and then in the final section of the horror theory reader, I have different takes on the appeal of horror for different types of audiences. So, what possible appeal does horror hold for, say, queer readers or viewers, or disabled readers or viewers, or people of color? So,
Mm-hmm.
it's a broad investigation of why anyone would want to subject themselves to what we typically think of as media that tries to evoke from us negative emotions.
Yeah, yeah, fascinating things, fascinating things. Um, what do people often get wrong about this genre or underestimate about horror?
I would say um, the two things that people perhaps get wrong about horror. The first is that it's in some way untethered from the real world, which I
Hmm.
think is a charge that's often made about speculative literature writ large, that fantasy and science fiction and indeed horror are primarily escapist and don't reflect the actual lives of real people. And to that, I would argue vigorously that what horror does is to express underlying anxieties, fears, desires, tabooed subject matter that are shared widely. And when a horror text strikes a chord with a broad audience, it's tapped into something of the zeitgeist, something of its moment. Um,
Hmm.
so the monsters in particular, and this is a fellow named Jeffrey Jerome Cohen who talks about it in a piece called Monster Theory. Um, he says that they're pure culture. That is that human beings birth them and they serve as metaphors for the things that we are afraid of and that we desire. So the first thing I would push back against is the idea that somehow horror as a genre is purely escapist and untethered from the real world. Um, and the second thing I might push back against is that there are those who think that horror is debased or debasing. That is, that audiences who seek out horror are in some way degraded by the experience or are giving into perverse inclinations. Um, and I think that horror often can play a very moral function. Um, like like I just said about the Stephen King piece, it's often about giving giving a shape to the things that worry us, that scare us, that we're anxious about, and then allowing us to combat those things or to reach some kind of detente with them to arrive at some kind of way to manage those negative emotions. So I think that horror can play a very important role, particularly in uncertain times, in allowing us to face fears that we may have, and seek some kind of resolution with them.
Very well said. Very well said. And that traces back to what you were saying about feminine experiences. I can't help but note that Mary Shelley, being someone prominent in science fiction horror, kind of leads off so much with this genre.
Yeah, I mean, Shelley is often considered to be the founder of science fiction with Frankenstein. You can kind of trace it back to
Mhm.
her, but it certainly is a text that falls into the horror genre. And there have been lots of different ways to interpret Frankenstein. Some of it is biographical. It gives Shelley's own experience of miscarrying and being unable to carry her pregnancy to term, and have the deaths that she experienced of those in her family as a kind of wish fulfillment to be able to bring those people back. Um, I mean, the interesting thing about Frankenstein, if you want to talk about Frankenstein, is those who only know Frankenstein from contemporary pop culture representations, I
Hmm.
think often are very surprised if they actually make it to the novel to find out how articulate the creature
Yeah.
actually is. It's not that monosyllabic grunting Frankenstein that you see from the Universal films of the 1930s. Um, he pleads with his creator for some acknowledgement, and Victor ends up being a kind of bad dad in many respects. And it's also, I think, an important conversation about the limits of science. Are there certain goals that shouldn't be pursued? Does
Hmm.
Victor go astray? Is it hubris from the start? Or is the problem that is the problem that he abandoned his child, essentially, and the consequences fall on his head as a result of that? So there's a whole conversation, I think, sort of about the ethics within Frankenstein, about parenting, and about science.
Yeah, yeah. And that ethical sensibility carries to Octavia Butler, the work that became prominent in 2015, 2016 Jordan Peele films, things of that nature. So it seems to be a genre that's always asking questions.
And part of what is interesting about contemporary horror, I think, is the prominent place given now to people of color, authors of color, who are really
Mhm.
stepping into the forefront and moving the genre forward. And a lot of what happens, and I'm thinking of Victor Laval, who
Mhm.
um, and Tananarive Due is another one who comes to mind, whose work is excellent. And it tends, I think, to ask us to compare the monster on the one hand to the larger monster of racism on the other. And you can look at the way either that racism creates monsters or breeds monsters, or the way in which racism becomes the monster itself.
Yeah, very important questions and timeliness as the horrors of daily life continue as well. I'm curious about the role of editor and how that gets to challenge you, but also the rewards, because I love that the academic process, but editing allows you to fold in additional voices so well. So curious about that for you.
Well, I've done two different, well, three different type. I've worn three different editors' hats, I guess you could say. There are traditional edited collections of scholarly chapters. So I have a number of edited collections. I'm working on one now that is Capitalism in the Gothic, and it assembles new scholarship on the subject, in order to investigate the focus. I have an edited collection that I did on the Rocky Horror Picture Show. I have an
Hmm.
edited collection on the films of Tim Burton. And I enjoy putting those collections together because it provides me the opportunity to work with like-minded scholars. So I'm in a position to establish relationships with them, to receive their scholarship, to offer feedback on it and help shape it, and then to try and shape an overarching volume that has a coherence to it. Um, with the monster theory reader and the horror theory reader, those are primarily assembling previously published scholarship. So in those
Hmm.
cases, I'm not working directly with the authors, and the primary burden there is obtaining permission for reprinting purposes. A lot of that has to do with then reaching out to the presses or academic journals or wherever these things were published. And then kind of shaping the volume in that respect. And again, I want some kind of overarching intellectual coherence to the way that the project comes together. So it's just not a haphazard assemblage of different pieces, but that they're organized in such a way that later ones speak or draw on earlier ones, speak to or draw on earlier ones. And then I guess the third editing hat that I wear is as a general editor for an academic journal. I'm now the general editor for the journal American Gothic Studies, which I founded, and we are working now on our third issue. And that is a different kind of editing in some respects. Edited collections of essays that come out in book form have a kind of circumscribed temporality to them. There's a start date and there's an end date. So you start when you solicit contributions, it ends when the book gets published. The journal is an ongoing process. So it's about management more than anything else as submissions are received, making sure that they're worth sending out for peer review, finding field readers, which is an increasingly difficult task. Um, Peer-reviewed scholarship depends upon the willingness of scholars to donate their time to actually do the peer review.
Mhm.
Uh, and compensation tends to be minimal or non-existent for that. So it depends upon the benevolence of scholars who are willing to donate their time. So I'm constantly looking for readers, then doing the editing myself, additional shaping of the essay, preparing it for publication. Um, so I've been very involved with editing from early in my career up to the present.
Yeah, and I can also relate to the challenges of attempting to find reviewers, and that well said with the other side of that coin, which is that it is an area of benevolence.
Yeah, it really does depend upon the goodwill. Um, I mean, some of it is the shared awareness that in order for my pieces to get published, somebody else will have to peer review them. So it's incumbent
Hmm.
upon me to do some peer reviewing. Like everybody has to participate to ensure that the journals continue to exist. Nevertheless, it's uncompensated labor for the most part, which speaks, I think, in some respects to larger problems with academia.
Agreed. Agreed. Yes. By means of a final question, and we can certainly add in anything else that we might have missed, but I am curious about the questions that you're probing now. Curious about resources that you would want to share with listeners. And again, delighted to see the horror theory reader out and published in the world for us.
I have a handful of projects in various stages at this point. The closest one to completion is the edited collection that I mentioned called Capitalism and the Gothic for Edinburgh University Press. So that's moving towards submission of the initial manuscript, probably end of March, early April. I've published two textbooks. One of them is called The Mad Scientist's Guide to Composition, and the other is called Pop Culture for Beginners. And I'm at work on a third textbook, which is moving along slowly, and I hope to make the bulk of the progress over the summer. It's an introduction to speculative literature, actually. So it deals with fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And surprisingly, there aren't a lot of resources in that area. So if you teach fantasy or science fiction, there's not a really great textbook, I think, which is why I'm working to make a contribution in that respect. And then I have a longer term project that's in the early stages that looks at the relationship between mesmerism in the late
Hmm.
18th and the 19th century with slavery. And so, in a lot of romantic texts in the 19th century, mesmerism plays a significant role. So, particularly in Poe and in Hawthorne, something like The House of the Seven Gables, for example, um, mesmerists play a role, as well as in romantic poetry. You can think of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner and his hypnotic eye, for example. And the argument that I'm going to make, hopefully, if I get there, is that there's just no way to talk about someone who takes possession of someone else's autonomy, their body, and their
Hmm.
spirit, without having as a frame of reference the most hotly debated question of the first half of the 19th century, which was the issue of slavery. So the idea is going to be that mesmerism becomes a displaced conversation about slavery.
Nice, nice. It sounds like much to explore on the way. Any additional resources that you'd like to mention or anything that we've missed before we
Well,
close out?
yeah, I mean, in terms of resources, in 2023, I founded an organization called the Society for the Study of the American Gothic. Um, and I like to think it is a useful resource for those who are investigating the American tradition of horror and the Gothic. American Gothic Studies is the official journal of the Society. We hold a biannual symposium. Our first one was in 2024. Our next one is going to be in March of this year in Salem. And I think increasingly we're adding resources that might be of interest to the website, which is AmericanGothicsociety.com. The other thing that we were involved with recently is the establishment of International Gothic Reading Month. And this is the first year.
Nice.
It's January, and it's going to be a recurring thing. Each January, there will be International Gothic Reading Month, and we're trying to reach out to libraries and educators so that they can uh, join in the observance of International Gothic Reading Month.
So wonderful. You are an active scholar. I appreciate your work. I appreciate your time. And may the conversation continue. Certainly glad to have you back anytime to talk horror, science fiction, fantasy, teaching, writing, or any combination thereof.
Lovely. Thank you very much.